Hi, everybody. My name is April Christina. I am a women's health advocate that focuses on faith, fertility, and facing endometriosis. So I started my menstrual cycle when I was 9 years old. So I was in the third grade, just trying to understand mathematics and English and science. But then my adulthood came very quickly when I found out in school that I didn't have an accident and that it was actually Mother Nature. So I came home, I was explaining to my mom, at the time, well, I don't know how it is for people now, but at the time when I started it, it was like brown. So I didn't know what was happening. It wasn't, red like how we normally experience a menstrual cycle to be. So I told my mom, like, I think there's something wrong with my body. Something's happening. I need to go to the doctor. And then that's when mom was like, "Oh, I think your period came on." So again, 9 years old, I wasn't thinking about any of that at all. I was just trying to be the best friend that I can be, trying to join sports and, just be a kid. And I found myself that following weekend going to the library with my mom, looking up different things as it relates to your menstrual cycle. And back then, they didn't have the books and the education for my age at that time that they have been. So I'm in the adult section trying to decipher all of the different vocabulary. So my mom had to walk me through everything. And it was really, first of all, it was very hard to understand, number one. And number two, to be able to have to get a bathroom pass, now to go to the bathroom because I frequently had to change my sanitary pad when I'm in elementary school was definitely something that I did not expect, but I learned very quickly on how to be a pro. And so as time went on, as I got into high school, my pain was really bad. However, I didn't have like the normal cramps. Like I would have headaches and I would have really bad leg pain that would make it very hard for me to walk. And I went through that for a very, very, very long time. My parents were very active in my health and my medical conditions. At that time, I didn't have any other than just having, my cycle when I was very early. So I ended up getting a pediatric OBGYN. They put me on oral contraceptives at the age of, I was either 13 or 14 when I started oral contraceptives just to be able to regulate the heavy bleeding that I was experiencing. And also, they were still trying to figure out why my legs was hurting so much. So by the time now I got into my 20s, I'm in college, still bad leg pain. Now I'm driving. Sometimes I couldn't drive. So now I'm going to a specialist to see if I have blood clots. They're making sure I don't have pulmonary embolisms because these are the signs of what a DVT is, a deep vein thrombosis. So I'm going monthly with my parents in my early 20s, getting everything checked out. Everything is coming up fine. I'm like, there has to be something else. So at this time, I just started being a healthcare professional. I'm a CNA. I'm working on the orthopedic unit. One of my patients was an OBGYN. She had back surgery. She was there for a few days. So she was in my district for a few days. I was like, look, I know you're healing. However, there's something else happening in my body, and I need to figure out what's going on. So I started explaining everything to her. She listened to me as a physician would do, and she immediately said, "Oh, you have endometriosis." So I'm staring at her the same way you're looking at me. And I'm like, I don't know how to spell it. I never heard of it before. By now, I'm in my mid 20s, just trying to navigate and figure everything out. I immediately called my mom. At this time, I was working a 3P to 11P shift. By the time I got home at 11:30, my mother had a stack of papers on top of papers that she had printed out of endometriosis. However, it wasn't giving the clinical symptoms of what everything was saying on the website, other than heavy menstrual when you have your cycle. So I'm like, okay. So I immediately changed positions. I went to her, went and got an exploratory laparoscopy. And when they went in, that's when I found out, and I was officially diagnosed with stage 4 endometriosis in my late 20s. So from 9 until my mid 20s, so almost 20 years on average, it says that it takes 7 to 11 years to be diagnosed with endometriosis, and I was pushing almost 20. So I went way past the margin of what they consider to be a normal diagnosis, but I mean, just to show the distance and the time frame of how long it takes for a diagnosis. And back then, clinically, I wasn't exemplifying any of the symptoms and the signs of someone saying that I have endometriosis. Also, my OBGYN at the time was an African American woman, and she said that there were other patients that were like me and of African American descent that had complaints of the same symptoms, which is why, as she was being a patient, she was able to tell me that I have endometriosis. But yeah, I went a very long time. And again, my parents was proactive. I was going to doctors, but I just was not going to the right physician based on what my condition was. So when it did happen when I was 9, my mother or my father wasn't surprised. They just automatically was like, okay, let's try to find different ways on how we can educate. My mother taught me how to calculate my cycle, which is how I still calculate it to today. Now, many years later. So I'm very thankful for the foundation that I had, even from a physician side, from having a pediatrician, and also from my parents, just really just making sure that their daughter is okay. So I've had 2 surgeries total. So initially, what ended up happening was, and the definitive diagnosis for endometriosis is what they call exploratory laparoscopy. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes blood tests can come back a little elevated. However, with mine, with me being as proactive as possible, going to a pediatric OBGYN, all of my lab results still came back normal, which is why they say exploratory laparoscopy is definitive diagnosis for a condition like endometriosis, because they physically need to see. Hopefully, one day soon there'll be another way, but right now that's what it is. So when they went in, they seen that I had the endometriosis. They did an ablation and they burned out the part that they could see. However, when it comes to staging with endometriosis, it's not even about the pain level, it's about how much endometrial tissue they actually see that is physically there, which led to my stage 4. As far as the leg pain is concerned, at that specific time, the first doctor that I had, the surgeon, should I say, it wasn't my OBGYN, it was another surgeon that actually performed the procedure. There was no correlation between that and the leg pain at that time. So I was still dealing with the leg pain, still taking narcotics, still trying to make sure that I function. Now I'm in college. I'm just trying to have some type of normal life. I was also relieved because now I have a diagnosis, but it was very sharp. It felt like a headache, like a migraine, but instead of it being in your head, it was in my legs, and it was both legs. Sometimes it would be one, somebody be two, but most times it was both legs, and it was so very hard to walk. It was so painful, very sharp. Then it radiated to my back. It was really bad. The only way I can explain is that it felt like a migraine in your legs, and they could not understand why. So now fast forward 10 months later, I got breakthrough bleeding. Like I said, since I was 9 years old, my cycle was like clockwork. I got breakthrough bleeding. I went back to the surgeon. I explained to him that I had breakthrough bleeding, and then he told me that my endometriosis came back. So now I'm confused because 10 months later, and now you're telling me my endometriosis came back. So that's when it became a little more alarming for me. At that time, I just thought I had a 30-minute surgery. I'm good. Life is better. I got some relief, but I shouldn't have to keep coming back every 10 months. So again, I explained everything to my mother. Thank God for my mom. She Googled everything up again. And then that's when she found out that there's actually specialists for endometriosis. At that time, I did not know that there were specialists for endometriosis. So I went to the city, to who my now endo specialist is, even to this day. He had a 3D sonogram. He couldn't see much, but he did say that he did see some type of scar tissue, which means that there's probably some other adhesions and other endometrial tissue, and I had to have surgery again. Absolutely devastated. He put me on a strict regimen as far as vitamins, as far as things that I had to eat. I was very confused because there was a bunch of information that I wish I had a year prior, to where I could have made a different decision. However, we didn't know. We was just trying to find the right answers. So that surgery ended up happening almost a year. So I had that surgery the January prior, and then that following March, I had my 7-hour excision surgery. So I wanted to had, and again, another thing that I love about my endo specialist, he wasn't the only doctor that was there. I had a cardiologist and I also had a GI doctor that was there in case if they needed to help him operate because he wasn't sure where the endometrial tissue had spread. Thankfully, he did have a GI doctor there, and that's the reason why I had to take the go lightly because I was able to personally flush out my system first before I went there, and secondly, it made it easier for them to see that the endometrial tissue actually was on my bowel. So that was the prep that led up to me being at the surgery. He explained to my parents, he's going to try to get as much as he can, but we already had the next date already set just in case. My endometriosis had actually spread all the way to my bowels. I had no clue. My doctor was asking my parents, like, was she impacted? Was she complaining of constipation? Was she having bowel movements? And my parents were like, yeah, as far as we know. So, the doctor's coming out midway and was like, we're still not even done with the surgery. I'm trying to make sure that it's not a two-part surgery. And so my parents made the executive decision for him to do as much as he can while I was still under anesthesia. And that's how the surgery ended up being 7 hours long. So the endometrial tissue had completely glued down both of my ovaries. So where it looked like one whole ovary. So he had to separate that. I had some fibroids. I had chocolate cysts as well, which is one of the diagnoses for people that have endometriosis. And again, the endometrial tissue had spread to my bowel. So they had to completely clean everything out. So that's why it took so long because it was a very intensive surgery. And what that physician ended up finding out, my specialist ended up finding out the endometrial tissue had actually adhered to some of the nerves and the tissues that were connected to the nerves in my legs. And that's what was causing the pain. So they had to remove that. However, because I don't know how long I really had endometriosis, that's still something that I deal with because it's just a chronic pain. And my specialist was very honest with my parents and I, and he said, look, I can't say that these symptoms are going to completely go away, but it is going to alleviate a lot of the things that she previously dealt with. So the leg pain I still do deal with. Is it on the same severity as it was before sometimes, but not as frequent as it was when I had my surgery 11 years ago. So after the procedure was done, I was definitely in a lot of pain. But to be honest, I think my pain threshold is so high at this point that it still just reminded me of the regular pain that I was already experiencing anyway. So it didn't really bother me as much. I could not urinate, so they had to straight cast me. Um, that was an experience, but a relief at the same time. I didn't even care because my mother was in the room and the nurse was like, "Do what?" I said, "No, no, no. Just do everything you have to do. Just make me feel better. Make me feel better." I stayed there overnight for observation, and they sent me home on narcotics. But again, my pain threshold was so high that I didn't even need it. I just took Tylenol. I was out of work for 6 weeks. And then I went back, showed me everything post-operatively. He checked my stomach, checked my bowels, make sure everything was good. We did another 3D transvaginal, and then I had to come back every 3 months for follow-up just to make sure that he didn't see anything. And now I come to him every year. So it took me about 2 to 3 months for me to actually start feeling like myself again. The pain was very minimal. And I will say that I do appreciate my doctor laparoscopically because back then I used to run marathons. I used to do 5Ks and 8Ks. So my vanity, I'm just putting that out there right now for the disclaimer. I was very nervous about the marks that the surgery was going to leave on my body. Like I think I cried more about that than the fact that I couldn't have red meat anymore. Like I was devastated because I already have a condition that's debilitating, that's affecting my pain, that's affecting my quality of life. The least you could do is just make my stomach still look okay. So what ended up happening was he had me sign a waiver. So what he ended up doing was the other option was he could go inside my belly button since I already had an Emmy. So they did like two small incisions on the bikini line, which nobody's gonna see that. And then the other incision that should have been on the side of my abdomen, he actually did inside my belly button, and then he reconstructed my belly button. And so things like that, when you're talking to your patient about certain things that affect them, something as small as that, that's something that someone may think is minor, to me was very major. And that made me even feel more comfortable that I had a relationship with my physician, that he actually understood my goals post operatively of the things that I wanted to do. I still wanted to stay fit. I still wanted to be healthy. I may not have been able to run marathons anymore, but what does that look like with how my body image is for me personally? Because I've already dealt with so many different emotions, dealing with a chronic condition, now trying to manage a chronic condition, and how, again, quality of life. What does that look like for me further on in the future? I end up finding out what triggered my endometriosis. It is very subjective, and it is very personal based on the individual. Some people can't have gluten and other things. That's not my case, but specifically red meat and soy really affects my body extremely bad. When I started realizing what I had to eliminate to have a better quality of life, and how much more free and how much more happy I was, and how I can actually be myself with eliminating one or two things out of my lifestyle, that's what really made me understand and justify how I was able to move forward. So again, sometimes I do have flares, but it's not as bad if I was to continuously consume things that I know is not good for my body. So I had to really rationalize with myself, like, April, do you want quality of life, or do you want to just enjoy this meal for how many minutes? So it it's a tug of war in my mind, but it's been 11 years since I've consumed red meat. So it's become very much easier than it was in the beginning of my journey. But I have to really put in the forefront what quality of life looks like for me and how I want to show up for myself to figure out how I show up in this world. Yeah, so we call endo for short in the community. So my endo and I, this endo and I, we have to be besties. Like we we have to be friends because I struggled so long with not liking the fact that I was diagnosed with a condition, that I had to also understand. Yeah, so even going further back to when I was initially diagnosed with endometriosis, it's a little bit different now in New York. But back then, there wasn't no support groups. I used to drive all the way to Boston. Having that community of friends, and I say that specifically because sometimes it's hard for family or friends to understand if they haven't been through anything like that. And it's not that they don't want to give support, and it's not that they don't love you. Sometimes it's just very hard for them to see someone that they love go through something, and they may not know the right words or right ways to be there and to be present. So to have certain communities and resources that are out there specifically that is catered to you, it makes a world of a difference. It definitely helped with how I felt. It definitely helped with my emotions. It helped with my feelings. It also validated how I felt, right? Because that honestly, most of everything that you go through is that you want to actually feel validated, that how you feel, what you're thinking, what you want to do, like you want to have those type of conversations. And again, there's so much uncertainty as it relates to fertility. But one thing is for sure, that when you're in this community, somebody understands what's happening. Someone has either thought about it or something very similar. So I just want people to not be afraid to use those resources and tools, especially when they're at no cost to you. The most that you have to do is just take a little bit of your heart and a little smidge of vulnerability, just to take that first step. Once you take that first step and you actually look up these resources and look up these tools, you'll actually see that it's a lot more beneficial, and it will actually help you a little bit more along the journey.